CB. Sorry for the slightly late start. First on the agenda, I've lost my agenda already. Okay, do we have any apologies for absence?
I haven't received any, Chair, but I noticed. Oh, thank you. I noticed that neither Councillors Alexander or Winders are here, so they may be sending apologies.
Yeah. Maybe they'll catch up and hopefully they're okay. Oh, and quick safety information, we don't expect any fire alarms, so if the fire alarm does sound, it's a real one, and just go out for the main doors that you came in through and then down the ramp. Okay, do we have any declarations of interest for today's agenda items? No. I'm going to declare a I used to be councillor for Cabot Ward back in 2015-2016, for which Avon Crescent was an area that I was part of, but that was a long time ago, and I don't have any predetermination in terms of this item today. Okay, so then item number 4, minutes of the previous meeting. Any issues with that? Guy?
Thanks, Chair. Sorry, this is obviously an incredibly nuanced discussion, and speaking specifically of the cemetery crematorium application and the decision to defer. There are a few areas where I wasn't sure the minutes necessarily reflected some of the nuance of what was being discussed, and I totally appreciate there's a lot of complexity. Begging the committee's discretion, I would really like to delay approval of those minutes for another meeting, just insofar as when I went back to check the video, the couple of things that I was able to check in time didn't quite match what was in the minutes, or at least it didn't, without meaning to cast aspersions on the minute takers in any way, there was quite a lot of nuance in what some of the committee members were saying, some of the questions asked and some of the answers given. And I think given the level of scrutiny that application was under, I would really want us to be belt and braces on that. So if it would be okay, I would, as I say, begging the committee's discretion, like to ask that we just delay that for a month so that I can just properly go through and make sure exactly certainly what I said and what I feel others say was reflected, if that's okay. That
sounds sensible to me. If everybody else can have a double check of what they said in the minutes, that would be quite useful. No, anybody who was there, if they could have a little look, that would be quite useful. Great, so if we send that back to you, Norman, just to have a...
Yeah, can I just be clear about which section it was that you weren't sure about? Because I can check the recording on YouTube just to make sure that it is right. If you can let me know. I mean, if you want to send me an email afterwards, that'll be fine. That
would be great. Thanks, Norman.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, guy.
Thanks. If you could just CC me in with that guy, that would be great. Thank you very much. Okay. Any other comments on minutes of the previous meeting? No. Okay. Okay, so if we move to item number 5, which is the action sheet, do we have any actions? I don't think we do. Exciting. Okay. Are there any appeals that you'd like to fill us in on?
Nothing.
Nothing?
Nothing to add.
Oh no. Should we put it in the middle?
But I wasn't. I wasn't going to add anything to any of the listed ones unless there are any questions.
Yeah. Does anybody have any questions about anything? Guy?
It was just a quick one, and probably one for a sort of written update rather than anything here, if it's helpful. But there were an awful lot that involved either appeals against refusals or appeals against enforcement notices for change of use to HMO, either through a discretionary scheme or the national scheme. And we currently have a new policy under consultation, and I would really like to know the basis on which those appeals are being made. In other words, what are the applicants kind of arguing, in a sense, so that we can at least bear that in mind as we go through the consultation process on the new policy, if that's something that could be shared, even if it's sort of in general terms. I think that would be something that would be really useful to us.
Yes, happy to take that away. Also, I did notice too that there were many specifically against HMOs, and so we are considering what can we do to sharpen up, basically.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, any other comments? Nope, okie dokie. What's next? Enforcement. No enforcements according to my agenda. Nope, fantastic. Okay. So then we come on to our items. So we've got some public forum statements in today. And so we don't have the traffic light system working now that we're down here. So our time you're using my little magic box here, and you'll have 1 minute to speak. If you come up to the microphone when I call your name, if you need to, you can lower it down if it's too high. You speak for 1 minute. When you get to about 20 seconds left, I'll do that at you. And if you could start then kind of doing your final points, and then I'll do that when we get to time, or hold my hand up or sort of signal at you. If you could finish up then, that would be really handy. Okay, so the first speaker I have is Mark Ashton.
Thank you, Chair. This relates to the application to remove planning conditions on the Bathurst Road Basin site. The committee must refuse the application and indicate its displeasure that the applicant has both
Could you go into the mic as well, Mark? Can't hear you very well.
The committee must refuse this application, indicate its displeasure that the applicant has failed to discharge both the 2014 and 2017 conditions and keeps trying to have them removed. For the committee to do otherwise would bring the planning authority into disrepute and destroy confidence in the delivery of major infrastructure schemes. The remaining 55 replacement trees, though probably inadequate compensation, that must now be planted without delay as originally required, need to be replanted, and that's our point. Hopefully this committee will have read all of the very excellent, I would suggest, and very cogent statements made by various people with an interest in this matter, which has been dragging on for 10 years. We have made numerous attempts to get planning enforcement to enforce the conditions of the council, but we're told they won't, and it's really left for you to decide this matter, a decision made by your committee at least 10 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Ed Plowden, I can't see him here. Okay, so then I have Valerie Steele.
These planning conditions, considered necessary to make the scheme acceptable, were supposed to be fulfilled before the first Metrobus run. They weren't, and in the years since, the council has endeavoured by any means to duck this responsibility. They've pretended to consult on various versions of schemes which they obviously had no intention of ever building, and in this final contemptuous gesture, bring an application to be absolved from ever doing anything. No mitigation for the visual vandalism of a new road running through heritage assets in a conservation area. No mitigation for the loss of trees incurred, and no measures to make the route along or across Avon Crescent any safer for the ever-increasing numbers of pedestrians and cyclists, apart from widening the pavement by painting a white line in the road. This identical application was withdrawn from the Mayor Committee on the very morning of the meeting, so officers could consider arguments made in favour of rejecting it. Apparently nothing anyone had to say was worth considering, and here we are with another example of why trust in the planning process is at such a low ebb in Bristol. Sorry, I'm speaking about the
Thank you very much. Okay, Martin Vans.
Good afternoon. Been at this 10 years. Metrobus built a major road through major heritage assets such as the Underfall Yard, the bonded warehouses, Nova Scotia Pub, Avon Crescent itself. Built a big road in a very sensitive heritage conservation area. And the way to get planning consent back in 2014 was to promise a shared space at Avon Crescent with tree planting, replacing the trees, a whole bunch of environmental mitigations, which the council is now attempting to totally absolve itself of all responsibility to build, I think it's very telling that on page 34, the paragraph at the top is talking about it's very important to get these conditions wiped. It's basically, I won't read it out because it's a long paragraph, but it's basically saying we need to wipe all the conditions so that in the words of this, in this paragraph, before a review of any outstanding planning requirements can be undertaken, such as compliance with planning conditions. It's a nonsense. Why was this application? If it wasn't a council-to-council application, it would not have been recommended. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Sorry. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Martin. Okay, next I've got John Tarleton, please.
Thank you. The application requests that condition 4 is discharged on the basis that 7 trees have been removed, 4 trees have been planted, leaving outstanding mitigation under DM17 at 11 trees. However, there is no account taken of at least 30 trees removed from between Cumberland Road and the bonded warehouse. Because these trees were removed without proper evaluation, we can only estimate the replacement required to comply with DM17 at between 50 and 90 trees. With the 11 tree replacements the applicant acknowledges, it is clear that at least 61 trees still need to be replaced. Therefore, there is no justification for removing condition 4, quite the opposite, as this has not been discharged. Indeed, in order to comply with DM17, there should be an increase in the number of required replacement trees at 55 to 61. And I would also suggest that if this condition is upheld, as it should be, that there's a time limit on it and that enforcement action is taken if they don't do it, because we've been waiting for 10 years for these trees. Thank you.
Thank you. Richard Walker.
Thank you, Chair and members of the committee. Yet again, we have to ask that you reject this fourth inappropriate attempt to get these outstanding and long overdue environmental, public safety and sustainable transport planning conditions removed. The inadequate justification offered by the applicant that the AVTM Metro bus development had no impact on Avon Crescent and its surroundings, that providing safe public access to Metro bus, safely reconnecting severed and changed walk and cycle routes between neighbourhoods and around the harbour side would add no value, aren't required anymore, and that somehow they weren't actually an integral part of the permissions for AVTM. These claims are clearly not the case. They're in sharp contrast with the approved AVTM revised application 2014, just one reference being, at Avon Crescent, significant changes to the current traffic management arrangement are proposed, including a bus priority sign junction. It is proposed to convert Avon Crescent into shared space. I also invite you to reject the misrepresentation of a disability equalities issue as an attempt to retrospectively justify not delivering any road safety measures. The 2018 DOT guidance is about not removing sensory drop curbs. It does not justify not implementing safe conditional road safety measures. One of the other problems here is the precedent it sets.
Sorry, you're going to have to finish up now. Yeah, could you finish up now, please? Oh, yep, thank you. Okay, Councillor Patrick McAllister, please.
Thank you, Chair. Trust is essential in politics. Local authorities must have the trust of the people they seek to represent and work on behalf of. This is especially true in the planning process, but as we all know, public trust in Bristol City Council's planning system has been seriously shaken by various recent instances. We are only hearing this application today because the applicant has previously taken on planning obligations and failed to fulfil them. Now, instead of making good on its promises, it proposes to have its slate wiped clean and its obligations nullified. This situation has been grossly unfair and distressing to residents of Avon Crescent who have had to put up with unmitigated disruption for years, and we should not seek to add insult to injury by doing away with their hopes to long-awaited improvements. If Bristol City Council's planning system is to have any hope of regaining and retaining the trust of a city, it must ensure that planning obligations that are agreed to are enforced regardless of timescales and not permit applicants to shirk their duties. Please refuse this application.
Thank you very much. Now, is there anybody here who's sent in a public forum statement but hasn't been called up to speak yet and would like to? Yep. Would like to come up and tell us who you are?
Thank you, Chair. My name is Andrew Clay.
Okay.
In 2014, planning consent was granted for the Metrobus scheme, conditional, and I repeat, conditional, on creating a shared space on Avon Crescent. How can Bristol City Council decide not to comply with that condition, which is what this application intends to do? Is it not a legal requirement? And does this therefore mean that future conditions attached to planning permissions are rendered meaningless? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Was there anybody else, or has everybody spoken who intended to? Okay, I think that's a yes. Thank you very much for coming for that part. Now we're going to move to the officer presentation. So just to be clear, from this point in, it's the planning officers and the committee that will engage with the process. So please don't call out, even if you may disagree with anything that is said, please do not heckle as best you can. We're going to pass to Alex for the presentation. The committee has received the slides just before this committee as well.
Thank you, Chair. So this is an application that relates to the Ashton Vale to Temple Meads Metrobus scheme. It is an application made under Section 73 of the Town and Country Planning Act, and it seeks to remove 3 conditions of the planning permission, which in itself is a Section 73 application on the original Metrobus scheme, which was approved back in 2014. In terms of those conditions, so there are 3 different conditions which are being sought to be deleted. So that is the submission on approval of a replacement tree planting scheme, removal of conditions 10 and 13, which are for the submission of full design details and then completion in accordance with the phasing plan. Effectively, those cover 2 kind of main constituent changes, which I'll cover each in turn. So one for an altered landscaping scheme based on the changes proposed, and then also removal of the enhancements proposed on Avon Crescent. So turning firstly to the landscaping condition, so it's proposed to remove this condition, and instead there is a planning obligation that has been put forward to secure off-site planting in accordance with the Bristol tree replacement standards. So that proposal is on the basis that fewer trees have been removed as part of the Ashton Vale to Temple Meads Metrobus scheme. So I've summarised those in the table there, so that we've gone from 11 trees which were proposed to be removed as part of the extant permission and reduced that down to 7. That reduces the overall requirements for BTRS from 30 trees down to 15. On the basis that 4 trees have been planted, there is a requirement for only 11 for mitigation in accordance with the BTRS. However, given that there was enhancements required or sort of sought as part of the Metrobus scheme, the applicant has actually offered to pay for 24 off-site trees to be planted. So that would be go into the area committee and then be spent planting trees within the location. In terms of the split of those trees, so I note that some of the comments flagged why was there a split between open ground and hard standing. That's been determined on the basis of the mix of trees planted in open ground and hard standing as part of the original scheme. So it's a contribution of just over £40,000 for those trees. The reasons why the trees can't be planted as part of the Metrobus scheme is largely due to the Section 278 process, so through the highway works and then also on advice of police. So tree planting locations that had previously been identified were no longer deemed to be appropriate, and were sort of blocking views and things like that along some of the locations. I note also within some of the public representations around the fact that there's tree losses in the vicinity of Avon Crescent and Bond. What we have suggested is that discussions are held with a local tree officer around the planting to ensure that the planting that has been removed but hasn't been assessed in the 2013 tree report occurs near the Bond building. And as a result, we concluded that because the reason that the condition was applied was to ensure compliance with the Bristol tree replacement standards, that we think that the proposed contribution complies with that and exceeds it. And as a result, there's no reason to insist on the condition, given that it would not be necessary or reasonable in line with the tests set out in the MPPF. Moving on to the Avon Crescent scheme, so I've just brought up an image of the extant permission. So this shows the public space, shared space rather, running through Avon Crescent. It shows the connection through under the bridge. So members that went on the site visit this morning will have seen this. The intention is to no longer implement the shared space along Avon Crescent, given that it was an enhancement proposed as part of the original planning application rather than specific mitigation. The proposal is as shown on the screen here via this image. So effectively there would be a sort of through route north to south or southeast. And then there'd be the opportunity for exiting and entering at that northern entrance as well. And where that crosses, there would be no entry for vehicles, but there's a system whereby a sort of short section of cycle lane through a contraflow would allow cycle access through from the south. This effectively is returning to the existing road layout that's proposed there. As I say, the enhancements that were sought as part of Metrobus are no longer deemed necessary because of the conflict with national policy. So you will see in my report there's reference to the national guidance on shared space and how that conflicts with that in terms of highway safety. And in fact, the 2014 committee report referred to objections from local residents that the shared space could cause conflict between pedestrians and vehicles. So again, we feel like we're consistent with that assessment as well. And that's just summarising in terms of the guidance there. So it's the inclusive transport strategy from Department for Transport. It's also been reviewed by Transport Development Management colleagues who don't consider it to be appropriate for the shared space to be implemented. And there's the quote from the committee report in 2013, which sets out effectively the objections from residents on the original scheme that they've now been asking to implement. And these are just some of the images which show the with the road open. You can see there that there's a white line just is seeking to extend the pavement. That doesn't form part of this application. That was implemented by the Highways Department through their sort of own highways permitted development rights. That sits out the application. And here's just a view from the top of Avon Crescent as well. So you can see the entrance point at the north and then the entry and exit on the left-hand side there as well. This just covers the reasons why the conditions were applied. So on the basis of maintaining the satisfactory appearance, protecting and enhancing the character of the site, and then ensuring that construction happens in a coordinated manner. And as a result, we've assessed that there are no reasons why the conditions are required any longer, because no changes to the road layout would mean that the appearance of the conservation area is safeguarded, and because there's the environmental statement sets out that the the elements on Avon Crescent are enhancements rather than mitigation for the scheme. We've determined that there's no reason for the conditions to apply any longer, given that the remaining elements of the scheme have been constructed. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Can you clarify why it was removed from the committee in May?
That was a decision made by the applicant for on the basis of their reviewing the objections and just making sure that they could be addressed. So that was a decision that was made by the applicant rather than by the planning authority.
Thank you very much. And so, in theory, to sort of consider other alternatives, what other alternatives were considered in the last few months?
I'm not aware of what the applicant has been considering in the background. We've been asked to determine this application, so we were contacted by the applicant in September and we were asked to determine the application as currently submitted.
Okay, thank you very much. Do I have questions from the committee? Fabian.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to be absolutely clear. The residents were promised a shared space development. Central government policy prevents us from doing that. So it's not a question of us wanting to not provide the shared space. Government policy is actually saying we can't do that. That needs to be, that needs to be made abundantly clear. Are we being prevented? And also, when did government policy change?
Yes. So as mentioned in my presentation, there is government guidance, so that inclusive transport strategy that covers that, which says that shared space is not an appropriate intervention here. Pip, I don't know whether there's anything else you want to add in terms of the government guidance.
It was exactly that. The national guidance doesn't allow that particular type of thing. There are different ways to approach it, but as we said, this wasn't a mitigation at the time, and my colleagues over the years have presented several options of variations, and none of them were acceptable to the local residents. So we have a history of being able to try to come up with something, but nothing was acceptable, and then the government guidelines overrode any of those without quite serious amendments, which we didn't have the resource to continue developing options at that time. I don't know whether it would be useful for you to understand that within my area of work, we are now going to be master planning that whole area, and I have agreed that we will make sure all the shortcomings from this will be included in that master plan, and it will be fully consulted up to an adoption by full council. So I do believe all of the issues raised, we're not necessarily disagreeing with the individual issue, but we're saying that we're separating it out from a general need in the area to master plan and include all of those areas of concern to be able to get that funded appropriately to deliver. And also my colleagues have identified with the local ward councillor that there is some money available for some interim tree planting, etc., to be utilised now. So there is compensatory action going to happen. I hope that's useful.
Lorraine.
Thank you, Chair. So two things. In regards to, sorry, I forgot your name again. I can't see that far. Right, so in regards to what you just said, bearing in mind, we've heard sort of we've heard testimonies from our residents and councillors saying trust has been eroded over time, not specifically to do with this, but in general. So if there was going to be a bigger plan, to incorporate the whole area, how would the residents feel confident that something that's promised is then delivered based upon their experiences of waiting 10 years for this to be delivered and for it to be being removed. So that's one thing. And I hope I don't forget my second question. Okay.
There is a procedure, formal procedure for any master plan or similar adoption process, which means we have to demonstrate that it has been fully consulted in to our duty of care standards. So it would be my colleague's job to make sure that an inclusive list is agreed with the local ward councillors before the process starts. And because I'm here listening to everything, I will make sure that all the concerned parties are consulted during that process. But it will take it will follow a pattern that is established. But just to be clear, we are awaiting how our administration will change. So I want to be careful that I don't contradict what will be the new reporting process. But what will stay is that a master plan has to have full council approval. So it would be required to demonstrate that all of those consultation exercises have been carried out appropriately.
Okay, thank you. The second part of my kind of question, I guess, is we obviously visited the site earlier, and I think there was a sense that I'm just going to speak for me, something needs to be done, and we did talk about the fact that something had been promised and then removed. So there was a bit of that was a little bit unsettling, because whilst I don't live there, but I wouldn't personally feel comfortable with that road being a shared space with cars, because the way the cars were driving down. But putting that aside, like coming up with something that's alternative, because what was nice as we were stood there was seeing all the joggers and so on and so forth. And wouldn't it be great to be able to find a way to make the space for residents coming out of their homes, people using the space for jogging and walking, and then the space for cars. So I came away feeling that something needs to be done, and I believe there is some monies available, and I wouldn't be happy with just saying, yeah, a developer just doesn't need to deliver. I think that's really uncomfortable, and it would set a really bad precedent. It's not really a question, sorry.
I think I did mention when we were on the site visit about members determining whether they feel that mitigation is required. I think that the documentation that's been submitted as part of the planning applications, the numerous planning applications on this, so the section 73 and the original environmental statement, have identified that this area was identified for enhancement rather than mitigating a specific issue raised by Metrobus, which is why we think as officers that it's better to defer it to a future project such as the sort of wider Western Harbour proposals. But again, if members think that the Metrobus application does need to be mitigated, then obviously that is a valid reason to sort of refuse the application potentially.
Thanks, Alex. Guy, you had a question?
I did, but I was wondering if the officer could just repeat that last sentence. Sorry, I think I misheard.
So really, in terms of the assessment, the information that's been provided as part of the application, so obviously we have the original consent, which was submitted and approved, included things like an environmental statement, included a wealth of assessment information that identifies and discusses Avon Crescent as being an area of enhancement, and rather than mitigating the impacts of the development, so therefore having to be provided in order to address the impacts of Metrobus. However, if members assess that there is mitigation that is needed, then it might be more appropriate to refuse the application.
Yeah, go for it, but into the mic.
Sorry, Guy. Yes, so this is what I wanted to say, so thank you, you've prompted me. There was something about mitigation, enhancement versus it wasn't directly going to be affected by Metrobus, but I would disagree, because I think what we've read, what we understand in our discussions was that promise for something to change on that road was based upon the Metro bus development in the first place. So there is a link between the Metro bus. Whilst the Metro bus isn't running down that road, it was all part of the what's the word? The carrot that I think the residents were offered. So I think it still stands. Thank you, Guy.
Yeah, no, we were chasing the same point. I think it was confirmation that this committee could kind of retrospectively decide that it was mitigation rather than enhancement, which sounds like it's the case. Cool. Gosh, that's almost made me forget the question I was going to ask. It was just in terms of shared space. First of all, was Councillor Breckles noted that had been the use of shared space in a situation like this had been banned by central government. I was just wondering when that was.
Yes, so that guidance, you'll see the reference on presentation, hopefully. It came out in 2018, so obviously there was a subsequent Section 73 application that was submitted around that time to try and address some of the concerns around the original scheme. That application unfortunately didn't get the support of residents, as Pip has mentioned, and was refused. So as a result, we're sort of standing with the guidance based on the publication of that previously in 2018.
So just for absolute clarity then, it's not so much that shared space has been banned, but rather there was a guidance document that was interpreted as suggesting that it would be inappropriate for a space such as this. I'm not saying it's desirable, I just want to be absolutely clear. If central government have said, you may not do shared space here, categorically, by law, that's one thing. If it's a precedent based on how local authorities have interpreted a guidance document, that might be something slightly different.
Very briefly, the key reason why it doesn't meet the standard is that particular crescent is quite difficult sightlines, and it has an area for parking on the opposite side of the road, which was desired to be maintained, so that area does not meet the criteria for the national guidance for shared space. If it had been straight road, where the sight lines from the entry point to the end were clear, there would have been potentially some options that we could have presented. But with if you stand on the main bus corridor junction, you can only see to a point clearly. So the designs, yeah. So the iterations before 2018 were never satisfactory. 2018 to local people, 2018 set a criteria that we then couldn't meet to be called shared space. There is nothing to say that that location couldn't have a low traffic arrangement or healthy street arrangement. As you know, the iterations of these things change. We're not saying they don't deserve to have something. We just don't want to propose something that we wouldn't be allowed to deliver.
Understood. As a final sort of question on this then, I'm just wondering what the residents have asked for during those consultations on those schemes. Have the residents put something forward? Have they suggested something that the council has taken up and worked up a scheme based on? How have we... I'm just wondering what we've tried to produce that does reflect what the residents were asking for in the context of that change in guidance.
You may remember, but we've just launched our design guide, and our design guide is in line with for the street design guide. It's now live, and so anything that came in now would have clear guidelines on what would be appropriate, and so it's easier for people to set the original consultation of an area of how it will look so that it meets the standard straight away. But DFT are meant to have updated their guidance again, and it's been delayed. So we would direct everybody at the moment to our design guide to including our internal project officers to do that. It would be the appropriate place to start, but it wasn't available at that time.
If I may, Chair, just for a very quick clarification, I'm sorry, I may not have expressed myself well, and this may not be an issue for the Transport Officer necessarily, but more for the project team working on Metrobus. I'm not sure are represented here today. I'm just wondering if anyone is aware of having realised in 2018 that what was promised to residents couldn't be delivered, what the response was from residents in terms of the residents' expression of what they would want as an alternative if that scheme couldn't be delivered. So someone mentioned earlier, I think it was yourself, that 4 schemes had been put to residents that had all been rejected. I'm just wondering what was put forward, what were the elements that residents were asking for, what were the issues with those schemes, what could have been delivered. Has anything come from the residents, I suppose?
In a nutshell, when my colleagues were originally doing the projects, the guidance hadn't changed. So they used the best information available, which was then offered as options. Those options were all turned down. Then at 2018, it changed what would be acceptable, and then we've subsequently amended our design guide to do that, but each time takes time to do. But so the process was done to the best of the knowledge available at the time from officers leading on the project.
Just to add, I think where we're all struggling slightly is having inherited a project that's been passed down a number of times. So saying what exactly has happened or not happened is difficult. What I would say is what the applicant has to do is consult on their scheme, not necessarily asking for alternatives. However, and the process that Pip has described earlier would be exactly that. Master planning would be inviting sort of co-design. And so I think we're just at risk here of conflating a number of things of what have been what was meant to have been happening in terms of consultation on the scheme that has happened. Whether or not as part of that alternative proposals were put forward, we don't know, and is kind of by the by.
Okay, I'm going to pick up the point, and I don't think it is conflating anything, but if there was an application that had conditions for this particular scheme, and now the guidance has changed, which means we can't do that scheme, but then now we have clear guidelines, why is this not being brought back with an application to change the conditions in line with the guidelines we now have, rather than just removing all of the conditions entirely?
Alex.
Yes, so that was tried to be rectified previously through the Section 73 application that was submitted back in June 2018. But that, again, as we mentioned, didn't get the support of residents, and that application was refused by committee on highway safety grounds. So there has been an attempt to address the guidance previously, but that didn't get the support of local residents or the committee. So that's why, and effectively, I think the applicant feels like they've run out of options in terms of other schemes that could be implemented on Avon Crescent.
But from what Pip's said today, you say that there are now clear guidelines for the design framework that's being brought forward?
I think the confusion is what is a highway matter and what is a planning matter. The planning matter was that these were not recommended for mitigation, they were recommended for enhancement. Separately, highways were carrying forward projects simultaneously with that. And then, so as a highway authority, we bear in mind the changes, and then we had to change our own guidance. But our guidance, it took nearly 7 years because it was being created prior to the change. So we would have the project and all the supplementary parts of the project to the main bus enhancement were being developed as projects. Some of them over a period of time got delivered, some didn't, but where they were deemed mitigation, they've had to be argued much more seriously, whereas this was enhancement, and there's no apparent change to the evidence that would have identified that's the key planning point, that there's the requirement of the condition in the original instance was to identify that it was an enhancement, and that's what we're responding to. If it had been identified as a mitigation, it would be a different, it'd be something different we'd have to address today. But because of the supplementary information I've given you about the master planning and everything, I'm hoping that will, so that you can focus on Alex's points of planning. That's where I'm here, is to show you that we're not forgetting things, but today is about the planning matter as opposed to the highway authority matter.
Okay, so I've got some questions around number 6 on your slides that you showed us with the original plan and the conditions. So accept that the shared space element of not having the pavement and the road the same height, but there seems like that there's basically pedestrian crossing type situations going on at the rear of Ashton Avenue, for example, and then at the other end of Avon Crescent as well as obviously the changing of the direction of the car parking. And what I'm not clear about is why those things can't happen, even if the pavement can't be the same height as the road. So why can't the applicant be offering pedestrian crossings? Because as you've said yourself, the sight lines are bad there. And I have concerns about that white line. Whilst we were there today, there was a lot of people, a lot of pedestrians, lots of joggers. There was some concern about me standing on the pavement that was actually the white line.
In hindsight, it would have probably been better to say traffic calming measures rather than shared space, because shared space has a specific guidance requirement. Traffic calming measures would allow a variety of options, but they would still have to adhere to whatever the DFT had changed further than just shared use in 2018. And those issues that are not specific to the bus, but specific to the close, i.e. the curvature and the parking retention, it would have always limited what we could have achieved there. If that's the only thing in hindsight, that if I'd been there at the time, I would have recommended we use just a different semantic, because traffic calming opens up a wider range of options, but it still would have been difficult. It still would have been difficult, and it still would have been an enhancement, not a mitigation. That's the key point.
But potentially, if that planning condition had been for traffic calming rather than shared space, we would potentially be in a different conversation right now.
I think it's possibly just important just to remind ourselves that the conditions are relating to completion of phasing and construction impacts. So it's not a requirement to build out Avon Crescent specifically. It's a requirement to complete all of the phases of the development. So it's not, there isn't a condition that says you must complete Avon Crescent. It's a condition that says that, I'll bring out the wording again, but it's effectively to ensure that the phases of development are sequenced. So I'll just bring up the, so it's the coordinated design elements identified. So there's a list in there, which are in my report. And then also a coordinated sequence of construction impacts. So that's the reasons why the conditions are applied. And this one, an Avon Crescent, is an enhancement. So therefore, we don't feel like we can, as a planning authority, demand that it is included, particularly when things like the construction have been completed and the existing road layout obviously is safeguarding the appearance of the area. So again, I think it's just we just need to be careful about not confusing the planning issues versus the highway, a highway safety issue on an existing highway layout.
Okay, Katja, I believe you had some questions.
I've now got so many questions. The first one was I'd noticed that you had to make it feasible for heavy goods vehicles or something, and I'm wondering why they need heavy goods vehicles down there. That was the first question. That was in the writing.
So the applicant has set out that one of the reasons why the shared space wasn't appropriate is because of access by heavy goods vehicles.
Why do they need heavy goods vehicles down there? There's no factories down there or anything.
So it's access to the harbour side, effectively. So obviously you've got shipbuilders, etc., down there looking to use that space.
And it's not the only access. Yeah, I know. I used to work down there.
There were some very big vehicles going down it today when we were on our site visit.
Was there?
Faster than 20 as well.
Was there? Okay. All right. And then the other one is to make it clear what is the difference between mitigation and enhancement, because it seems to be that this is where the pivotal question goes. Is there more money? Is it more that you have to do it? Or where the money comes from?
So Metro Bus, obviously, as a project, sought to deliver enhancements as well as mitigations for its impacts. So you will have seen I mentioned things like the additional tree planting, so they're going beyond the BTRS for the tree replacements that they've assessed. That is the same for this project, part of the project as well. So Avon Crescent was identified as an area where enhancements could be delivered rather than addressing a specific mitigation, so i.e. the bus going through and, causing noise disturbance, air quality issues outside somebody's front door.
That's the difference. Okay. So the bus is not actually going through there, so they don't need to put in something to make the noise of the bus or the amount of people walking to the bus. That's the mitigation. So enhancements is if they make it better to live. But okay. All right. The other thing is, if they're planting the trees off-site, surely the trees have to be planted nearby as a mitigation, because the trees, when they're there, they're providing a function of shade, of air pollution, they help with air pollution, those kinds of things. But if you move them away, then that area is not getting that anymore, the plus sides of the trees.
Yeah, that's correct. So no trees were actually removed specifically from Avon Crescent, but they were removed from the area. And I know one of the public statements has flagged that there were trees removed outside the A-Bond building, but weren't assessed as part of the application. Again, it's a 10-year-old application, and I'm not sure why that wasn't included as part of the arboriculture impact assessment at the time, whether they were removed as part of a different scheme. But again, that's not clear to myself or to the project manager, having spoken to the applicant. However, what we have said is that we'll work with the tree officer for the area to make sure that those 24, or that contribution towards the pay, so the £40,000 goes towards planting trees within the vicinity of the application site.
Yeah.
I'm thinking that rather than, I think we need to vote on each condition separately. And I'm thinking that rather than scrapping the one about trees...
I mean, this is more into a debate, Fabian.
Yeah, I know, but I'm just want to ask, could we amend condition 4 so that we either stipulate that the trees have to be planted in the vicinity, or we condition that the monies are given to Area Committee 5, which I believe is the area committee for this area, for, so that the sort of where the trees go can be done by local agreement.
Amendments to conditions can be suggested, yes.
Lorraine.
Thank you, Chair. Right, I want to go back to what I said right at the very beginning in regards to, I know it was 10 years ago, officers weren't here. I understand that, and I think that's important to recognise that. However, I think that if a community was promised something, it doesn't matter whether it was an enhancement or t'other, they were offered something. And the mitigation for what they were being offered was based upon the Metro bus, which wasn't going to go down their road, but it was going to be in the vicinity. We know all that's factual. So I think all I want to understand on behalf of the residents is they were offered something, an enhancement. They haven't had an enhancement. That is the bottom line. And I want to know what they will get as compensation. I'm not talking about financially, what they're going to get. I'm standing on that road today. We were there, all of us, for 40 minutes or so today. And there are issues with the road, but for the enhancement they were promised, we wouldn't have been stood on that road. So there has to be some acknowledgement, I think, at least, that they were promised something which is not going to be delivered. The promise wasn't illegal because we were going to enhance the area in order for the Metro bus to be delivered. So the Metro bus is delivered, but the community hasn't had their enhancement. And I don't know how you're going to make sense of that, but that's really what's stuck in my head. I'm sorry, but that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, I guess we have to determine the application that's before us today. We can't make suggestions. So if members aren't satisfied with what's being proposed today, then obviously they either through amended conditions proposed or by refusing the planning application. But we can't. We can't go.
My child, I forgot.
we can't go making suggestions through this sort of determination this afternoon.
No, I'm really sorry. I know you do feel strongly, but no. It's an absolute no. Please sit down. Please, no. Okay, seriously, sit down or I will get you thrown out of this chamber. Thank you. So to remind the public in attendance again, this bit is just for the committee, and I do understand it is very frustrating and you may not agree with everything that we're saying and you might want to give clarifying points, but we cannot, and it's a really important part of the regulatory committee process that we have this separation. And I know it's frustrating, but please bear with us and let us carry on with the debate and conversation around it as best we can. So, had you finished what you were saying? Thank you very much. Simone.
Sorry, I was just going to add in response around the promise that to also bear in mind there has been the other attempt at bringing a resolution in 2018, which also got refused. So I think it's around how far to go in trying to explore enhancements, and I think the emphasis again needs to be around enhancements that were promised, because they are, strictly speaking, not necessary. Mitigation is necessary, enhancements are not strictly speaking necessary.
Thank you. But also just to remind you that we do have the power as well to decide whether or not this is indeed a mitigation rather than an enhancement. So if we could all keep that in mind. Fabian.
I have to agree with what Lorraine has said. I think several on this side do. They were promised something in exchange for, as part of the upheaval with the Metro bus, and to then leave them with nothing is a bit rubbish, as far as I'm concerned. I know that there's 50,000 in SIL that's been earmarked. I think at the very least that should be earmarked for working with the residents of Avon Crescent on something maybe low traffic, you know, maybe making it more of a low traffic road. It's not the same as shared space. I noticed that the white line on the pavement, so you've got a bit of pavement, then you've got a bit of road and a white line, which for me looks a bit rubbish. Unfortunately, the 50k wouldn't cover widening the whole pavement, which is what I'd at the very least like to see, or like to see offered to the residents, because, you know, that would, you know, be better if, you know, that would be a visible improvement. So I think we need to be looking, rather than repealing these conditions, we need to be looking at amending them. And I know condition 4 is the trees. Which is the one that specifically, explicitly relates to the shared space, which we now can't implement because of government rules?
So in particular, that's condition 10. Condition 13 is relating to construction impacts. So I think if there is an expectation that a scheme is delivered on Avon Crescent, it would be wise not to seek the removal of that condition, because that controls the sequence of construction. But it's condition 10. I appreciate I've got the reasoning there, but under the application section in the committee report, that condition set out in full. And that covers alongside a number of other things. It's quite a long worded condition, but it says in drawings submitted to satisfy this condition, amendments to the drawings submitted with the application shall be made, including the parking layout within Avon Crescent, to ensure that an appropriate means of access is retained to under 4 yard, review of crossing points in Avon Crescent, and another item which sits outside of the sort of discussion points today, but that's the key elements of those conditions in terms of what it secures.
So we would have to. So basically, we have to agree to repealing condition 10 because legally we can't actually implement it. But 13 and 4 are separate matters altogether, and we can keep 13. I don't know whether we'd need to amend it to tie that 50k to Avon Crescent, so they have at least got something, you know, some money in the pot to start work with, and also retain a condition about the trees, but amend it.
I don't think we would be able to condition sill. The sill regulations are pretty specific in terms of not being linked specifically to a planning condition. So that tends to be what Section 106 agreements are, where they are directly linked to development and they have to meet certain tests. The earmarking of sill is obviously made by those area committees, so that's a process that kind of sits separate to planning applications specifically. So I'd advise caution if we were trying to look to condition sill. Simone, sorry.
But there was an application back in 2015 or 16 for the neighbourhood partnership. That was a mechanism for allocating sill before 2016, and there was an application for 50,000, which obviously won't go as far now as it used to, but that is still there in the pot allocated to Avon Crescent, so that could be used for something. So there is some funding available for something there, so there is some scope.
I think the point I was going to suggest, given that there needs to be a memorandum of understanding anyway, as part of the recommendation, that could be the mechanism, I would think, that you instruct basically for that to be included. So for the utilisation of the 50k to be included for traffic calming measures. Yeah.
Although traffic as discussed and agreed with the residents of Avon Crescent.
Guy, I think we're moving to the debate stage of life now. So unless anybody has any more questions, should we move on to? Do you have more questions? You always have more questions. Okay, yeah, go on. More questions, off you go. Mike.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry. In terms of the difference between a mitigation and a enhancement, then, what was the legal test at the time, I suppose, is one question. And the other question would be, when we assess this now, is it in light of, it seems from the officer's report to read as though whether they be enhancements or mitigations offered, included as part of the planning consent at the time, are now being assessed on the basis of planning policy now, which is obviously has moved along. I just wanted to check that's the case.
So in terms of determining whether something is a mitigation or something requires mitigation, there is a very long and very complicated environmental statement that was undertaken as part of the application in 2013, and then so that identifies specific areas and locations where mitigation is required, and Avon Crescent isn't specified within that. It does talk about the impacts of the enhancements themselves and the impact that they would have on the character and the townscape, but identifies that those are benefits to the area, and it talks about having a benefit, the Metro bus scheme having a beneficial effect on Avon Crescent, as opposed to elsewhere in other locations where it would have talked about, but buses coming past, impacts upon traffic in the area if you're introducing a bus lane, for example, and narrowing the amount of traffic that can use an area. So there are specific impacts which are identified within that environmental statement. In terms of the local plan policies were adopted, obviously, our local plan policies were adopted in advance of the 2013 application being determined, but obviously national policy has moved on since then. So we've determined the application on the basis of the latest policies that have applied, but also in light of the extant consents that are in place as well.
If I may just add, I think to come back to the distinction between mitigation and enhancement. Mitigation is where there's a direct impact that needs to be made good, basically. Whereas enhancement, I think you could see more like a voluntary additional offering. In terms of change of the situation, in terms of the EIA, that has been referred to, and where it's coming from, that part of the system, I don't think has changed since then. So I think, that in that sense, the legislation around in EIA terms has not changed, and therefore it would be more, I suppose, whether you take a different judgment, but on what basis, and that the EIA was prepared by professionals at the time, and therefore I would have thought that is what we should be taking our cue from.
Just as a for instance to make sure I've understood it correctly, though, for example, we heard a number of times from the public forum that a significant number more trees were removed than the ones that are mentioned in the report today. So in other words, the trees that were due to be planted were mitigation either for a greater number of trees, or they were an enhancement based on the felling of fewer trees. And we have a conflict of assertions. We have the council saying it was a smaller number of trees, and the residents saying it was a greater number of trees. But it seems to be fairly factual as part of the scheme. The trees were there, they're not there now. How are we to judge something like that?
So there was an arboricultural impact assessment that was assessed at the time of the application. The trees that were referred to within one of the public forum statements weren't assessed as part of that arboricultural impact assessment, and therefore haven't formed part of the consideration of this application. It's not clear to me whether those trees were removed as part of Avon Crescent and then weren't assessed as for some reason. I've tried to get to the bottom of that this morning, obviously having received the public forum statements and this issue not being raised previously. And again, I've checked that with the applicant team. They're not clear that, or they don't believe that the trees were, they're not clear that the trees were removed as part of the Avon Crescent, the AVTM scheme.
So, leaving aside whether it was a coincidence or not, what I suppose I'm getting to is, when assessing whether it's a mitigation or an enhancement, are we making our own judgment as a committee as to the circumstances at the time, or are we attempting to sort of look into the minds of the previous committee that made the decision?
It still stands whether the development is proposed or whether the development is current. If there are mitigations that are required, then they need to be implemented. Whether it's an extant a working scheme, which we've got now, or whether it's a proposed scheme, if we believe that there are mitigations that are required, they have to be delivered.
Fabian.
Yeah, I'm still thinking, part of me thinks, well, mitigation enhancement doesn't actually matter. What matters is they were promised something. A lot of what we was initially promised we can't now implement because Department for Transport rules will not allow us to implement it. Okay, so that is what it is. They were still promised something, and I think we need to give them what we can, which means, the SIL that is earmarked, that needs to be honoured, and we need, a memorandum of understanding to ensure that there is work with the residents of Avon Crescent to develop whatever kind of low traffic or mitigation, whatever they want with that money, and possibly with some other money if there's other money that can be bid, that the ward council can bid for from the Area Committee 5 pot. And I admit that the pots are fairly low, so there's a lot less money kicking around than we had hoped. But I also think we need to, on the tree front, I don't think it's acceptable to just delete that condition. I think we have to amend that condition on condition 4 on the trees, because it's quite clear from the aerial photos that trees were taken out for the Metro bus route around, so that what goes sort of on the guided bus only sort of route round towards the bridge. Clearly there were quite a few trees taken out there, so we do need to mitigate for those.
Thanks. For me, I think it's not really good enough to say just because it's been a long time, it has been 10 years. And it hasn't been implemented. And to say, well, it's been a long time, things have changed. I think had this scheme been implemented at the same time as Metrobus generally, before 2018, then the shared space would have been implemented like shared space schemes have been implemented elsewhere in the city, and it would have been within regulations. I think traffic calming can still be implemented there, and it should still be implemented there. And I think we should be treating this application like any other application and not be talking about the applicant as us. It's not us, it's the applicant, it's not us. And if the applicant of any other application has spent all of their money elsewhere, then they should still be held to the conditions of their planning application. I think that, it's great to see something come forward through Western Harbour, but this has been 10 years in the making, and this was a condition that was offered as a sweetener to offset the impacts of the Metrobus scheme upon the residents here. And whether or not we call it an enhancement or we call it a mitigation, it's a bit potato as far as the residents are concerned. So it's within our gift, within our power as this committee sat here today to decide whether or not this is a mitigation or an enhancement. For me, it is a mitigation of the significant impacts of the Metrobus scheme. I think also when it comes to the trees, yes, they could be offset and or not even offset, but planted anywhere within the area, whatever area committee number Harbour and Hot Wells is in. But I think you'll probably be able to tell me, Guy, because I think it's your area committee. It could be Clifton. They could be planted up on the edge of the Downs, which is not the same. They should be planted in this area within this scheme. Otherwise, it is not fair. So that's my 10 pence on it. I'll pass to Guy, and then I think I had Katja and then had Lorraine.
I concur wholeheartedly, Chair. I think that it's, without meaning to disagree with my colleague across from me, the difference between mitigation and enhancement is absolutely critical to this. It's not that the residents were promised something and the council hasn't delivered it. That happens more often than we'd like to recognise, frankly. this is a case of the residents were promised something as part of a process for a major item of infrastructure work in order to mitigate for the effects of that infrastructure work on their lives, and the council's failed to deliver it, and now it comes back to us as a planning committee because they've asked to be let off from their obligations. To me, I wholeheartedly concur with the chair. It's a mitigation. It was never an enhancement. There may have been a legal argument at the time that could have been raised for saying it was above and beyond what was necessary, but at the time the council was engaged in a wholehearted, I like to think, attempt to engage with residents around the scheme. And frankly, I remember there being an awful lot of talk about how vitally important it was to get this scheme through, and that pretty much any sacrifice that had to be made would be made because the scheme was so important. And now we come back to look at it more than 10 years later, I think, certainly since this initial piece of work would have been done. Currently, I'm minded to just refuse all three. If anyone wants to try and talk me out of it, they're welcome to. But I think we need to hold the council's feet to the fire, and I would encourage all councillors to think what we would do if this was another developer rocking up 10 years after the fact to say, well, I know we agreed all this stuff to get the residents on board at the time, but now we've run out of money. Let's ask for permission to do the other thing. I do also think it's something councillors should bear in mind when they look at the local plan that's going to be coming to council reasonably soon, that it's quite possible to review a developer's obligations based on the new policy rather than the old one, and to decide what we think their obligations might be in that context. So that's maybe something to chat about in the future. But for now, I think I'm going to vote to refuse all three. Thanks, Chair.
One of the things that's come to me, which is getting me quite frustrated, is you can see the lack of funding and a lack of investment we've had in our infrastructure in the last probably 20, maybe even longer years. And part of this is the teams keep changing in the council. I know that's more of a financial in the way we work, which is quite sad, and nothing personal on the teams here. And that creates this mess that nobody understands what's going on. The second one is the lack of infrastructure. I mean, there was a sentence that really struck me. It says, no changes would ensure the appearance of the conservation area is safeguarded. And I'm like, what do you have to do to make it look worse? And this is exactly what I mean. There's been no money, or the money seems to disappear where the infrastructure is thing. And I do think that this is a mitigation because they've made that area a little bit worse. And it's not just about whether you ran across the road and got knocked over, which obviously we need the mitigation for, but it's also about that you live there, that the area is not what it was before. It was an attractive area, and now it's less attractive. And trees, I'm afraid they are life-saving, and they are really important going forward with climate change. So the idea that you can just plant them somewhere else, that doesn't sit with me fine at all. So I'm agreed to follow your lead and decline or against it. Yeah, thank you. Lorraine?
Okay, thank you, Chair. I mean, I stand by what I said from the beginning, which is the residents were promised something, they haven't got anything, and that is totally not unacceptable. I think you can do covenants, which is what you said, to say that that monies that are going into an area could be sort of designated, so we need to do that. I think that we can come up with some way to enhance the road outside residents' homes as they were promised previously, albeit not shared space, because that is hideous, because it's too dangerous along there. So I am totally on the side of this is a different planning team, this is a different planning group from previously. We have to do the right thing. We're not breaking any laws by rejecting the plan. So I'm going to vote against it. I'm going to vote against the plan. Sorry, I just had to make sure I said that around the right word, for all the reasons that my colleagues here have said today. Thank you.
Right. Does anybody else want to? Fabian, of course you do.
Yeah, I'm certainly going to vote against scrapping conditions 4 and 13. On 10, that is the one we can't implement anyway. Is that correct? Because that's relates solely to the shared space that is now ruled out of order, or is it wider than that?
It doesn't preclude another way of discharging that planning condition. So if there is a scheme that's acceptable to committee, residents, etc., then another plan, such as the 2018 plan that was also refused, could come forward.
So we can basically
In that case, it makes sense to refuse all three.
Yeah, if we just, what we can do is, if we're ready to move forwards, then I can propose the officer recommendation, nobody has to second that, and then it will automatically fall, and then somebody can propose that we reject the application, somebody can second that, and we can vote on that, and then it's back over to the applicant. Yep. So
Can I just clarify, though, that if you go down the second route of being minded to refuse, that you need to also give us a steer around the reasons, the planning reasons for which you would be wanting to go down that route, but also that this then needs to come back the next time with worked up reasons for refuse, because it would be going against officer recommendation, needs to come back, but it needs to have the cooling off period and needs to come back, at which point you can either still go with the reasons for refusal or you could reconsider.
And I think the reasons to refuse is that an applicant should be held to their planning applications. This guy. But into the mic.
Thanks, Chair. Sorry, bad brain day. I had one question, now I have two, so I'm just going to get through them quickly. But in regards to what was just said, the cooling off period clause, is that an absolute requirement, or is that a suggestion? Is it guidance?
As in, is it standing orders, or is it constitutional, or is it convention?
Exactly. Would it be unlawful not to go through that process, I suppose?
It is council policy, and therefore we would be in breach of our own policy, and as such, I believe that would certainly breach legal principles around expectations. Because basically there's therefore a legitimate expectation that you follow the policy, and if you therefore don't do that, you're in breach of natural justice. But that's not legal advice because I'm not a lawyer.
Before we sue her.
I nearly was, but that was my reading of it too. Thank you. And my other question was in regards to this. Sorry, I may have misunderstood something. I want to make sure I'm absolutely clear on it. The Section 106 money that was under discussion, that was earmarked, how tightly bound was that Section 106 money? Because I could, in one sense, I could envision that Section 106 money, if very tightly bound to this scheme. I find it difficult. Sorry, SIL, obviously.
So the SIL application that came through the neighbourhood partnership was earbound for, I can't remember the exact wording of what it was, because best part of 10 years ago, but it was for Avon Crescent explicitly.
It just occurs to me, Chair, that and I concur with my colleagues' view that the local residents are absolutely entitled to spend that money and absolutely entitled to mitigate the effects of this scheme, as was. It just struck me that what we're in effect doing is taking two duplicate issues. We might be taking money that is for the residents to decide how to spend and advising them or requiring them to spend it to fulfil council conditions that were separately conditioned. In other words, one might take it as the council saying, we're not going to do this, but remember that money we gave you to do other things, you can spend it on this and you should.
No, I think we're talking about two separate things still. Yeah, because if I remember, the SIL application was for on top of, it's not actually attached to these obligations, it is money to be spent in Avon Crescent just generally on traffic related things. That's my technical remembrance.
That is not something that we have all the details on, but if you're asking us to go away anyway, this is maybe something we could find out and bring back.
Lorraine.
The bottom line is The residents were promised something under the Metro bus scheme, and 10 years down the road, they have not been mitigated against for the said scheme, and that is it. I don't think that's illegal for us to say we therefore reject the application, and that's what I'm going to do. Are we allowed to vote now? What's the voting, Chair?
We can. So what we're going to do is, so I'm going to move the officer recommendation to approve, and if anybody would like to second that, they can, or you could not. And if nobody does, then that falls. So I'd like to move the officer recommendation to refuse. Do I have a seconder?
To refuse, yeah.
No, to grant, rather. Ugh, I'm tired. So, okay, so that falls because we don't have a seconder. So therefore, do we have a motion to refuse? Who's going for it?
Oops, sorry. I have a motion to refuse the officer recommendation.
Thank you very much. Guy, were you wanting to second that? Was that your arm waving, or?
Yes, Chair. It's what I wanted to make sure of was how that motion to refuse works. I'm happy to second. I'd really like to, because I really want to see it refused. If there's an issue around legal expectation, and we have to follow that process, that was my reading of it. I was very surprised when the committee started taking that process as guidance. I was more surprised with subsequent developments around how that process is used. But bearing in mind this committee, I just want to be absolutely reassured that what we would be sending officers away to do is on the basis that we wish to refuse the scheme, and we wish for officers to clarify in evidential terms the reasons for that refusal, i.e. not to come back with another report forming another balanced view, not to, that's the direction of steer.
And to be clear, it's to refuse the application to remove conditions rather than refuse the scheme. It's...
Oh, if only, Chair, but no, historically speaking, yes, to refuse the application in front of us.
Sorry, could I just say in response to that, we still need the reasons from you, the planning reasons why you wish to refuse it, because we can only work up those reasons for refusal with your steer. And also to say, what comes back to you will still have to be the full planning officer's recommendation.
It doesn't have to be a recommendation to approve still. If the steer of the committee is to refuse, it can come back with an officer recommendation to refuse. And I'd like it to come back with an officer recommendation to refuse.
But that would...
Indeed, I think it will still have to be the whole picture and on planning merits. And yeah.
Into the mic, yep.
This is about conditions that we are not, or we are proposing, mindful to not remove. I don't see, I mean, you know, how are we supposed to sort of rustle up, you know, planning reasons to not cancel conditions? It just seems a bit, because what we're doing is we're simply leaving the conditions that are on an existing permission in place. That's all we're doing. So,
yeah, it might be helpful, Chair, just to point out, as kind of set out in the officer report, I've effectively assessed the reasons why the conditions need to be applied. So I've got the reasons on screen there. So I'd expect that if members were minded to refuse the application, it's likely to be on the basis that they consider that the conditions still need to be applying, because if the conditions were removed, for example, the character of the area would be unsatisfactory, there'd be concern about provision of infrastructure and construction impacts, or in terms of the trees, if I just move to that reason for refusal, reason for the condition to be applied, that there would be inadequate mitigation for loss of trees. So I would suggest it's almost the reasons for the conditions applying, but in reverse, if that's helpful.
That sounds good. And also that we view it to be a mitigating condition rather than an enhancement condition as well. Does that satisfy Guy? And then, Lorraine, who was first?
I don't know. I was just going to say, so what he said, and the fact that we are saying that the residents were, as part of a substantial previous planning highways application, whatever it was, the residents were told that in order for that development to go ahead, that they would be enhanced in some way.
Or mitigated rather than enhanced.
Absolutely, mitigated for that Metro bus scheme. And that is one of the reasons why we will be refusing. So that should also go into the pot.
Sure. Guy?
Chair, without treading on anyone's toes, but because I wanted to see where this phrase cooling off period came from, because I remember when this was first brought in, and that's categorically not how it was presented at the time. There's a really critical difference between giving a committee an opportunity to come to a different judgment, which is arguably what cooling off period could be taken to mean. That is very different from going away and asking officers to produce a completely different view. Is again very, very different from asking officers to lay out in very clear planning terms the somewhat occasionally chaotic nature of the discussion and the debate within the committee. However, looking at the scheme again, stage 5 of that process is really quite clear. So we're at the point where a motion has been moved in line with the officer's recommendation. That wasn't seconded and it fell. The next stage would be for the chair to move a motion to defer, which does not, if that doesn't have a seconder, that too will fall. And then the chair may seek a motion from the committee, which doesn't require a deferral at all, doesn't require a break. We could make a decision to refuse right now based on what's just been discussed. So if I may, Chair, I think given the situation we're in, we may wish to, if the Chair wished to make a motion to defer, see if anyone wants to vote for it, we could then move to a motion to refuse based on Councillor Hernchen's motion, which I would still be more than happy to second.
I'm more than happy to make a motion to defer.
Yeah, and I agree, because I've sat on committees where we've felt confident that we had the good reasons to refuse before us, didn't need to defer. You know, deferment is something to use when there's some uncertainty, when we're minded to refuse, and officers get that, but there's some uncertainty exactly how to word the refusal and all of that, and that's when you've had that's when the deferral period has been useful. I think we've got the reasons to refuse now. We do need to take a vote on defer or not. And if that falls, then we can make a vote. I think we can make a vote to refuse straight away.
Exactly. So would anybody like to second the vote to defer? No. Okay, that falls. So thank you very much. So therefore we have Katja's motion to refuse, seconded by Guy. I'm going to take a vote on that. I'm going to start off with Guy. So
Aye.
Yes. Lorraine, would you like to refuse it?
What am I saying? I mean, I want to refuse this.
Yes. Yes. The answer is yes.
Sorry, I'm getting confused now. Yes.
Yes. Or, yeah. Hold on. Do you need...
Can we just step it? I think it needs to be clear what exactly the reasons for refusal are. And
I think, Simone, we've been really clear on repeat what our reasons are to refuse.
Yeah, put that into the vote.
Can we put it as part of
We are very clear. We are very clear.
It's basically all the, so condition 4, we refuse to lift that because we're not satisfied that adequate mitigation for the loss of trees on the site will be fulfilled without that condition.
Exactly.
Something on those words. The next one...
Fabian, we have been really clear on repeat, and we have this recorded, so you can also watch it back if you require. Fabian, how would you like to vote? Would you like to vote to refuse?
I vote to refuse.
Thank you, Katja.
I vote to refuse.
Thank you. Amal?
I'm going to refuse.
Thank you. Sarah?
Yeah, vote to refuse.
And it's a refuse from me, so that's unanimous. Thank you very much. So that application is refused. Thank you very much. That brings us to an end. Our next meeting is on the 29th of November. Thank you very much.